Wales, April 1945. The wind swept across Camp 100 at Island Farm in Bridgend, carrying rain that turned the compound into a landscape of grey on grey, sky indistinguishable from mud. Lotte Neumann stood in the women's assembly area as a British medical officer approached, his footsteps splashing through puddles that reflected nothing but clouds and barbed wire. She felt the wetness spreading down her legs, warm against the cold, soaking through her prison dress in a pattern she tried desperately to hide. The officer spoke in English she barely understood, asking questions about health, about medical conditions, about whether anyone needed immediate attention. Lotte opened her mouth to answer, to explain that something was terribly wrong, that she'd been bleeding for 3 days and couldn't make it stop. Instead, the world tilted sideways. Her knees buckled. She collapsed forward into mud and rain and the officer's startled exclamation. The last thing she saw before darkness was blood spreading through grey fabric. Undeniable proof that her body was failing in ways regulations said shouldn't matter. What happened in the next 36 hours would shatter every assumption she'd constructed about enemy doctors, about medical care during captivity, about what it meant when people chose healing over the convenience of letting prisoners suffer. Lotte's story began 8 months earlier, in August 1944, when the transport carrying her from France arrived at Dover. She was 31 years old, married to a Wehrmacht officer who'd been killed at Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day. She had worked as an administrative assistant at a German supply depot outside Paris, processing paperwork for an occupation that was collapsing faster than anyone admitted publicly. The Allies had swept through France with speed that made resistance futile, had captured hundreds of German civilians caught behind lines that moved too quickly to escape. Lotte had been among them, arrested along with 40 other German women who'd worked for the occupation, transported to England as prisoners of war despite having never worn uniforms, never carried weapons, never made military decisions. The regime's propaganda had prepared her for British savagery. Stories of Churchill ordering German women imprisoned in dungeons, of systematic abuse designed to punish anyone associated with the Reich. She had heard tales of female prisoners worked to death, of medical care deliberately withheld, of treatment that violated every civilized standard because enemies deserved no consideration. She had braced herself for brutality, had told herself to endure whatever came, had resolved to survive through silence and invisibility. Instead, the processing at Dover was bureaucratic and methodical. Medical examinations that were thorough but not invasive. Documentation that recorded her civilian status, her work history, her marriage to a deceased soldier. British officials who looked tired rather than cruel. A system designed around cataloguing rather than punishing, around establishing status rather than inflicting harm. Then transport to Wales. A train journey through English countryside that bore no resemblance to the bombed wasteland German propaganda described. Through towns with functioning infrastructure, past fields where farming continued despite war, alongside British civilians who stared at German prisoners with wary curiosity more than hatred. Lotte pressed her hand against the window, watching this enemy country pass, trying to reconcile reality with expectation. Camp 100 sprawled across 75 acres at Island Farm near Bridgend. Built in 1944, it had been designed to hold Italian POWs initially, then expanded to accommodate Germans from various capture points. By spring 1945, it held over 1,500 German prisoners in the main compound, and in a separate facility built with unexpected consideration, 63 German women in various categories. Civilian workers like Lotte, military auxiliaries, nurses captured while serving field hospitals, wives of German officers who'd been caught in occupied territories, all women, all prisoners, all waiting for war's end to determine their fate. The women's section was different from the men's compound. Smaller barracks with actual privacy partitions. A communal area where women could maintain fragments of normal life, could sew, could talk, could exist as something beyond prisoners. Medical facilities staffed by British personnel who treated German patients with clinical efficiency that was neither warm nor actively hostile. Professional distance maintained, but competence present. Lotte was assigned to Hut 9. She shared the space with 7 other women, all former civilian workers, all widowed or separated from husbands by war's chaos. 14 women total in a building designed for 12. Privacy was negotiated through careful choreography. Personal space was measured in the width of a cot. But they had shelter. They had food that was adequate if monotonous. They had safety from the chaos consuming Germany. In February 1945, Lotte's menstrual cycle became irregular, heavier than normal, lasting longer, accompanied by cramping that was increasingly severe. She mentioned it to the other women in Hut 9, received sympathetic shrugs and advice that amounted to wait and see. Women's health issues in POW camps weren't exactly priority concerns. The British medical staff were there primarily for emergencies, for infectious disease control, for ensuring prisoners didn't die from preventable conditions. Menstrual irregularities fell into the category of uncomfortable, but not critical. By March, the bleeding had become constant. Not menstrual cycles anymore, but continuous hemorrhaging that soaked through the limited supplies of cloth she could access. Lotte tried to hide it, tried to manage it quietly, tried not to draw attention because admitting medical problems meant admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability felt dangerous in captivity. She rationed her movements, spent more time sitting than standing, avoided activities that might make the bleeding more obvious. The other women noticed but didn't comment directly, offered spare cloth when they could, maintained the fiction that everything was manageable. In early April, the cramping intensified to something beyond manageable. Pain that made her double over, that made breathing difficult, that suggested something fundamentally wrong was happening inside her body. Frau Weber, the eldest woman in Hut 9, finally insisted, "You need to see the British doctor. This isn't normal. This could kill you if it's what I think it is." Lotte resisted. Seeing doctors meant examinations, meant exposing herself to enemy personnel, meant admitting that her body was failing in ways that felt shameful, even though shame made no medical sense. The propaganda had taught her to fear British doctors, had suggested they might experiment on German prisoners, might provide inadequate care deliberately, might see German women as less deserving of treatment than British patients. But the pain won. On April 18th, Lotte reported to the camp medical station, a separate building near the women's compound, staffed by a rotating team of British military medical personnel. She was seen by Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, 29 years old, army nurse who'd trained at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary before the war, who'd spent 3 years treating casualties from every theatre before being assigned to POW camp medical duty. Mitchell took Lotte's history through a translator, one of the German-speaking British officers assigned to camp administration. Constant bleeding for 6 weeks, severe cramping, progressively worsening symptoms. Mitchell's expression shifted from routine to concerned. She conducted a physical examination that was professional but thorough, palpated Lotte's abdomen, noted tenderness and swelling that suggested serious complications. "This requires more extensive evaluation. I need to examine you internally to determine the cause." The translator conveyed this in German. Lotte tensed, fear overriding rationality. Mitchell recognized the reaction, her tone softening slightly. "I understand this is uncomfortable. But whatever is causing your bleeding could be life-threatening if left untreated. I need to determine whether you have fibroids, infection, or something more serious. I'll be as gentle as possible." The examination revealed what Mitchell suspected. Significant fibroid tumours, multiple masses in the uterine wall that were causing hemorrhaging and would continue worsening without surgical intervention. Mitchell explained this through the translator, her clinical language translated into German that made the situation clear. Lotte needed surgery. Real surgery. In a proper operating facility, not the limited emergency care the camp medical station could provide. Mitchell documented her findings, submitted a formal medical recommendation to the camp commandant. Prisoner requires immediate surgical intervention for uterine fibroids causing severe hemorrhaging. Camp medical facilities inadequate for procedure. Request authorization to transport to civilian hospital for necessary surgery. The request went up through bureaucratic channels. Camp commandant to regional military authority to medical command. Each level required review, approval, justification for using civilian medical resources on enemy prisoners. The Geneva Convention required adequate medical care, but adequate was subject to interpretation. How urgent did conditions need to be before civilian hospital access was justified? How severe did bleeding need to be before it counted as life-threatening emergency? While bureaucracy processed paperwork, Lotta continued deteriorating. The bleeding increased. The pain intensified. Her energy levels dropped as anemia worsened from continuous blood loss. She stopped attending morning roll call, spent most hours lying on her cot, conserving strength that was steadily depleting. The other women in Hut 9 brought her food she couldn't eat, water she forced herself to drink, quiet company that couldn't solve medical problems requiring surgical solutions. On April 22nd, during morning assembly, Lotta tried to stand for the routine health check. Lieutenant Mitchell was conducting her weekly rounds, asking standard questions about medical conditions requiring attention. Lotta stood up, felt the familiar wetness spreading down her legs, more blood than cloth could absorb, soaking through her dress in patterns that would be visible to everyone. She tried to speak, to explain, to ask for help. Instead, darkness rushed in from the edges of her vision. Her knees buckled. She collapsed forward into mud and rain, and Mitchell's startled reaction. Mitchell caught her halfway down, eased her to the ground, immediately began assessment. Pulse rapid and weak, skin pale and cold, dress soaked with blood that was still flowing. This was hemorrhagic shock, life-threatening blood loss, emergency requiring immediate intervention beyond what camp facilities could provide. Mitchell made a decision. She commandeered the camp's ambulance, ordered immediate transport to Bridgend General Hospital. Without waiting for authorization that might take hours Lotta didn't have, she climbed into the ambulance with Lotta, 2 medical corpsmen, and began emergency treatment during the 15-minute drive. IV fluids to maintain blood pressure. Pressure on the abdomen attempting to slow bleeding. Constant monitoring of vital signs that were declining despite intervention. At Bridgend General, they were met by Dr. Thomas Welch, 43 years old, veteran surgeon who'd served in North Africa before returning to civilian practice, now managing a hospital overwhelmed by wartime casualties but still functioning as proper medical facility. Mitchell briefed him rapidly in medical terminology that transcended politics. 31-year-old female, German POW, hemorrhaging from uterine fibroids, symptomatic for 6 weeks, acute crisis within past hour, requires emergency surgical intervention or she will die. Welch examined Lotta, confirmed Mitchell's assessment. This patient needs immediate hysterectomy. The fibroids are too large to manage conservatively. She's lost significant blood volume already. We operate now or we lose her. The hospital administrator raised immediate objections. Authorization procedures, resource allocation protocols, the complexity of performing major surgery on enemy prisoners. Welch cut through bureaucracy with surgeon's directness. I have a patient dying of hemorrhagic shock. I have the skills to save her. The politics are not my concern. Prep the operating theatre. Within 20 minutes, Lotta was in surgery. Welch worked with practiced efficiency, removing a uterus that was distended with fibroid masses, controlling bleeding that had been slowly killing her for weeks, repairing damage while Mitchell assisted with the same professional competence she'd shown throughout. The surgery lasted 2 hours. Lotta received blood transfusions from British donors, received sutures and antibiotics, and all the interventions modern medicine could provide. She woke in a hospital bed 6 hours later, disoriented, in pain from surgical incisions, but alive. Mitchell sat beside her bed, monitoring vital signs, waiting for consciousness to return. When Lotta's eyes opened, Mitchell spoke through the translator who'd been summoned. "You had emergency surgery. The bleeding has stopped. You're going to recover. But you nearly died. If you'd waited another day, we wouldn't have been able to save you." Lotta processed this information slowly. She was in a British hospital. She'd been operated on by British doctors. They'd used British blood to save her life. The enemy had healed her when letting her die would have been easier, would have required no effort, would have eliminated a German prisoner without any violation of regulations. Over the next 5 days, Lotta recovered in Bridgend General under Mitchell's primary care. She shared a room with 2 British civilian patients, women recovering from their own surgeries, who stared at the German prisoner with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort but not active hostility. The hospital staff treated her with the same clinical efficiency they offered everyone. Not friendship, exactly, but professional competence. Not cruelty either. Mitchell checked on her multiple times per shift, monitoring recovery that was progressing well. On the 3rd day, during an evening round, Lotta found English words she'd been practicing. "Thank you. You saved my life." Mitchell shook her head. "I did what any doctor would do. You needed help. We provided it." "But I am German. I am enemy." Mitchell met her eyes. "In this hospital, you're a patient. That's all that matters here." Lotta felt something crack inside her, carefully maintained emotional armor. "I was told British would let us die. That you hate us too much to help." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. "Some people do hate Germans. Some Germans hate British, but hatred doesn't belong in medicine. When someone is bleeding to death in front of you, you don't check their nationality before deciding whether to save them." On Lotta's 5th day in hospital, something unexpected happened. Dr. Welch came to her room, not for routine rounds, but for conversation. He pulled up a chair, spoke through the translator with directness that suggested this wasn't comfortable for him. "I wanted to explain something about your surgery. The fibroids we removed were larger than I expected. The hemorrhaging was more severe than normal for this condition. If you'd waited another week, possibly even another few days, you would have bled to death. There's no question about that. You came very close to dying." Lotta absorbed this. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand that the hesitation to seek medical care nearly cost you your life. I don't know what you were told about British doctors, but I need you to know that we treat medical emergencies regardless of who needs treatment. Your nationality didn't factor into the decision to operate. Your need did." "I was afraid," Lotta admitted. "Afraid that asking for help would make things worse." Welch nodded. "I understand that fear. But medicine doesn't work if patients are too afraid to seek care. If you died in that POW camp because you were afraid to trust enemy doctors, that would have been a tragedy beyond the surgery I could have prevented." The conversation shifted something in Lotta's understanding. These British doctors weren't performing compassion, they were performing medicine. There was a difference. Compassion suggested emotional investment, special treatment, mercy granted from position of power. Medicine was simply professional obligation executed regardless of circumstance. They'd saved her life not because they pitied her, not because they'd forgotten she was German, but because saving lives was what medical professionals did when patients needed saving. Before returning to Camp 100, Mitchell gave Lotta something practical. A supply of sanitary materials, far more than camp supplies provided. "You'll still have some bleeding during recovery. This should help manage it without discomfort." Lotta stared at the supplies. "Why are you doing this?" Mitchell's expression suggested the question itself was strange. "Because you need them. Because medical care doesn't end when surgery is over. Because recovery requires appropriate supplies and you shouldn't have to suffer from inadequate resources." Back at Camp 100, Lotta returned to Hut 9 accompanied by detailed recovery instructions Mitchell had written out, translated into German. Rest required for 4 weeks minimum. No heavy lifting. Monitor for signs of infection. Return immediately if fever develops or bleeding resumes. The camp medical staff would continue her care. But Mitchell had ensured continuity by documenting everything in clinical detail that assumed competent follow-up, regardless of nationality. The other women in Hut 9 gathered around her, asked questions in overlapping German, wanted to know what British hospitals were like, how British doctors had treated her, whether the propaganda's warnings had been true. Lotta tried to explain but found words inadequate. They saved me. Not because they forgot I was German, not because they pitied me, but because that's what doctors do. They save people who need saving. Frau Weber understood better than the others. So the propaganda lied. Yes and no, Lotta said slowly. They didn't treat me like a friend, but they didn't treat me like an enemy either. They treated me like a patient. Which is somehow more important than either. The story spread through the women's compound within days. The German prisoner who'd nearly died from hemorrhaging, the British nurse who'd commandeered an ambulance without authorization, the emergency surgery performed on an enemy national because doctors prioritized medical need over political convenience. The other prisoners heard it as evidence that British, despite being enemies, operated under medical ethics that transcended nationality. That the Geneva Convention's requirements for prisoner medical care were being honoured not just technically, but substantively. In May, as war in Europe ended and repatriation planning began, Lotta received something unexpected. A letter from Mitchell, delivered through official channels, approved by camp administration, written in English with German translation attached. Dear Mrs. Neumann, I hope this letter finds you continuing to recover well. I wanted to follow up on your condition and remind you that the recovery period for hysterectomy is approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Continue following the post-operative instructions, monitor for complications. Don't hesitate to report any concerning symptoms to camp medical staff. I also wanted you to know that treating you was not unusual or exceptional from a medical perspective. It was simply appropriate care for a patient who needed emergency intervention. I hope that when you return to Germany, you'll find medical care that continues treating you as a patient first, regardless of political circumstances. The war has ended. Healing should continue. With professional regards, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, RAMC. Lotta kept the letter carefully, read it multiple times through tears she didn't fully understand. The British nurse hadn't written about friendship or forgiveness or bridging divides between enemies. She'd written about medical care, about recovery protocols, about the professional obligation to treat patients appropriately. That professional distance felt somehow more genuine than emotional declarations would have been. Lotta wrote a response, though she wasn't certain it would be delivered. Dear Lieutenant Mitchell, thank you for saving my life. Thank you for treating me as a patient when it would have been easier to let regulations delay care until it was too late. I understand now that medicine and politics are separate things, that doctors see patients, not nationalities. That healing happens regardless of which side people were on during war. I will remember this for the rest of my life. I will tell people that when I was dying, British doctors saved me not because they forgot I was German, but because saving patients was more important than remembering who was whose enemy. With gratitude, I cannot adequately express Lotta Neumann. The letters crossed through military postal systems, 2 women from enemy nations communicating about medicine and recovery and the possibility that professional ethics could transcend political enmity. Repatriation began in June 1945. Germany had surrendered. The infrastructure for returning prisoners commenced. Lotta was scheduled for transport in July from Liverpool to Hamburg, then whatever awaited in occupied Germany. Before leaving Camp 100, she was given one final medical examination by the camp's medical staff, ensuring she was healthy enough for transport, confirming recovery was progressing appropriately. The examining doctor reviewed Mitchell's surgical notes, checked her post-operative healing, and made a notation that would follow her medical records. Patient received emergency hysterectomy for severe fibroid hemorrhaging in April 1945. Surgery successful. Recovery uncomplicated. Patient should be aware that emergency medical intervention likely saved her life. Future medical care should note surgical history. Lotte crossed back to Germany in mid-July, joining millions of displaced persons trying to reconstruct lives from fragments. Hamburg was devastated, infrastructure destroyed, medical system barely functional. She settled with distant relatives in the city's outskirts, began the long process of rebuilding existence in a country that bore no resemblance to what she'd left. But she had something others didn't. Medical documentation from British doctors, surgical notes from British hospitals, evidence that she'd been treated as a patient rather than a prisoner, that medical ethics had transcended political hatred, that enemies could choose healing over the convenience of letting prisoners die. Mitchell and Lotte corresponded sporadically for 23 years. Letters crossed between Wales and Hamburg, less frequent than friendship, but more sustained than mere professional courtesy. They became evidence that medical treatment could create connections that transcended war's divisions. Mitchell visited Hamburg in 1961, a holiday tour that included a brief detour to meet Lotte. They sat in a cafe, drinking coffee, speaking through Lotte's now functional English about April 1945, when everything had been terrible and uncertain, but medicine had prevailed anyway. "You saved my life," Lotte said, the same words she'd tried to express 16 years earlier. Mitchell shook her head, familiar response. "I provided appropriate medical care. Any competent doctor would have done the same." "No," Lotte was firm. "Any competent doctor who saw patients as patients first. That's different from just competence. That's choosing to see humanity even when politics says you don't have to." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. But I think medicine requires that choice. If doctors start categorizing patients by nationality or politics, we've stopped being doctors. We've become something else." They embraced briefly, two women who'd been on opposite sides of history's worst conflict, now connected by shared memory of emergency surgery and medical ethics, and the possibility that healing transcended hatred when given opportunity. Sarah Mitchell died in 1979 at age 63. Her obituary mentioned distinguished service in RAMC, post-war work in military medical administration, dedication to improving POW medical care standards. It didn't mention the German prisoner whose life she'd saved by refusing to wait for authorization, the emergency surgery performed on enemy national because medical need couldn't wait for bureaucratic approval, the demonstration that professional ethics transcended nationality. Lotte Neumann died in 1983 at age 69. She died in Hamburg, having rebuilt a life in Germany transformed beyond recognition. Her last words, according to relatives, were about the British nurse who'd saved her. "Tell Sarah I kept the letter. Tell her I taught my nieces that enemy doctors can be the best doctors if they remember that patients come first." The surgical notes remain in British military medical archives. Documentation of emergency hysterectomy performed on German POW, April 1945, successful outcome, patient survived. Clinical language that doesn't capture the emergency decision, the refusal to wait for authorization, the choice to prioritize medical need over political convenience. But the facts remain. Mitchell saved Lotte's life by refusing to let regulations delay necessary care, by insisting that hemorrhagic shock required immediate intervention regardless of patient nationality. The story became part of medical historical record. Researchers studying wartime medical ethics cite it as an example of how professional standards could transcend systematic enmity. Medical historians reference it when discussing evolution of POW medical care. But the deeper meaning isn't in academic analysis. It's in the simple fact that a British nurse looked at a dying German prisoner and saw a patient, that a surgeon operated on an enemy national because medical emergency didn't recognize political boundaries, that healing transcended hatred when medical professionals chose to prioritize competence over convenience. The hospital where it happened has been modernized repeatedly. Nothing remains of the operating theatre where Welch performed emergency surgery on a German prisoner. But in Bridgen General's archives, there's documentation, surgical notes, recovery records, Mitchell's detailed post-operative instructions, all testament to the fact that in April 1945, medical ethics prevailed over political divisions. 36 hours after Lotta collapsed bleeding in front of British medics, she woke from surgery that saved her life. That reversal, from dying prisoner to recovering patient, represented everything complicated about war's end, about medical ethics, about the possibility that professional standards could provide common ground when politics demanded division. The regulations said, wait for authorization. The regulations prioritized proper channels over emergency intervention, required bureaucratic approval before using civilian resources on enemy prisoners. But one nurse said no. One surgeon agreed. One emergency demanded immediate action that couldn't wait for paperwork, and one German prisoner survived because medical professionals refused to let nationality determine whether dying patients received treatment. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is refuse to wait for permission when someone is dying in front of you. Sometimes, what happens in the 36 hours after collapse rewrites everything you thought you knew about enemies and doctors and the boundaries of professional ethics. And sometimes, the impossible becomes possible, because medical professionals remember that patients are patients first, that hemorrhagic shock doesn't recognize nationality, that healing is healing regardless of whose life needs saving. The letter remains. The surgical notes remain. The historical documentation remains. Evidence that in April 1945, in Wales, a British nurse and surgeon saved a German prisoner's life, not because they forgot she was German, but because letting patients die for political convenience violated everything medicine represented. And in that choice, however constrained by war's context, they demonstrated something that transcends historical record. That medical ethics provide no exemptions for enemies, that professional competence means treating whoever needs treatment, that sometimes the most important victories happen in operating theatres rather than battlefields, when doctors choose healing over the easy indifference that would let prisoners bleed to death.